Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Stantec Water webinar series. We're pleased to present Bill Kennedy, our Industrial Water Regional Discipline Leader. Today, he'll be talking about the proposed revisions to the steam electric ELGs. I'm Tony Fink, your host for today. During this meeting, you'll be in listen-only mode. We invite you to submit questions at any time during the presentation. If you're joining via your computer, you can do so by expanding the questions box on the side panel of your screen. If you're on a mobile device, click on the question mark located at the top. Your questions will be addressed following the presentation. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Bill to get us started.
Well, thank you, Tony. And once again, good afternoon. And for those of you that aren't in Eastern time, good morning still. Let's see if there we go. I'm Bill Kennedy, and I've been working on the steam electric effluent guidelines in a number of roles over the years. Here's my charming smiling picture here, and I like to point out when I first started working on the effluent guidelines, my beard was not gray and I had a little bit more hair, so welcome. At Stantec, we always like to start out our meetings with a safety moment, and we thought that given this time of year, sun safety is a good topic for all of us, whether it's at work or at home, where there's potential for sunburn, which short-term can be very uncomfortable, not only for ourselves and family members, but then long-term, we've all heard of the potential for skin cancer risk. First off, stay in the shade whenever possible. Down here in the U.S. South, that's a good idea for any number of reasons. Clothing, if you can cover up with long sleeves and whatnot, a hat also with the brim type keeps the sun off your neck and ears. Had a cat that used to have sunburnt ears and ended up having issues there. So, ears are sensitive. If you're using sunscreen, make sure you apply that at least 30 minutes prior to going outside, and then reapply every 2 hours. And also don't forget to wear sunglasses. As we're getting close to the summer solstice here, keep in mind that the sun's rays are closer and closer, higher in the sky, or the sun's higher in the sky, and as the shadows get shorter, and that's between 11 o'clock in the morning and 3 p.m., that's the highest risk. So that's a great time to go inside, have lunch, take a break before going back outside. So our topic for today is the EPA's 2023 proposed rulemaking for the steam electric power generating point source category of effluent limitation guidelines and standards. This is a proposed update, and I emphasize the word proposed because just as in 2013 and 2019, EPA proposed rules, solicited comments, and what came out in 2015, then again in 2020, was impacted to a significant degree by the comments EPA received. So the focal point on the proposed rulemaking are, first off, flue gas desulfurization wastewater, bottom ash transport water, legacy wastewaters, and then coal combustion leachate. EPA published this rule, this proposed rule in the Federal Register in March 29th of this year, and provided a nominal 60-day comment period, and that comment period ends on May 30th. And our legal disclaimer here, the following is a technical overview of the proposed rule and is not intended to be comprehensive or provide legal interpretation, advice, or site-specific regulatory guidance. So I think all the attorneys are now happy. So there's a glossary of terms. Didn't hit all the acronyms that are in there, but some of the ones that are of significance as we go through this presentation. BAT for best available technology, bottom mash transport water, best professional judgment, combined waste stream formula, ICS, initial certification statement, publicly owned treatment works, POTW, and then pre-treatment standards for existing sources. So starting with FGD limits here. What is FGD wastewater? EPA clearly defines in the rulemaking or in the rule that wastewater that is generated specifically from wet FGD scrubber systems that comes in contact with flue gas or FGD solids, including blowdown from the scrubber system, over or underflow from the solid separation process, that's the gypsum dewatering, any of the wash water from the dewatering system, and then filtrate from the dewatering system. That's all officially FGD water, wastewater. What is not FGD wastewater is any cleaning water from the scrubber, solid separation, and dewatering equipment. Cleaning water from the paste transport piping. Floor drains in the FGD process area, and then treated FGD wastewater permeate or distillate that's sent back to the boiler as makeup water. So in 2020, EPA provided some exceptions to the best available technology limits they provided. The first exception was for low capacity utilization units, and that was defined as on a rolling 2-year calendar average basis that generation was less than 10% of unit nameplate capacity. The next exception that was put out there in 2020 was for high flow units or high flow sites that had more than 4 million gallons per day of FGD water. The cessation of coal combustion, that if there was a commitment to cease coal firing of the units by December 31st of 28. And then the last exception that was offered then was the voluntary incentive program. And that was based on utilizing membrane technology. EPA offered a compliance date of 2028 rather than the 2025 date for the BAT. In 2020, there were limits that were offered or set that for arsenic, mercury, selenium, and nitrate. And I've always focused on the monthly average as a design basis or a concern, more so because of the analytical turnaround time for arsenic, mercury, and selenium. It's not something we would traditionally have online monitoring for. And so trying to keep our numbers always below the monthly average has been a focus. So we also have nitrate, nitrites in there. And as you can see, those numbers are pretty straightforward there. So with the proposed rule, it's no discharge of FGD wastewaters. And that's as soon as possible, 60 days of final publication of the rule, but no later than 12/31/2029. So what they're proposing is, hey, we're going to give you an extra year to have no discharge over what the current rules are on the books. The VIP option continues to be out there, where there is a daily max value of 5 parts per billion, mercury with a monthly average down at 10, selenium with a daily max of 10, nitrate, nitrites, keeping it down below 1.2. But most significantly on the VIP option is the fact that there is a 0.2 part per million bromide limit, and there is a TDS limit that's out there, a monthly average TDS of 149 parts per million. I'd like to point out that the TDS limits proposed or that are in the VIP are typically less than secondary drinking water standards. So there's potential if you have municipal water that you're using to flush the system that it would not meet the VIP requirements. And for that matter, drinking water standards for any number of these constituents are much, much higher than allowable under the VIP option. This time around, EPA created a new subcategory for early adopters. Industry and a number of conversations with EPA and with the Office of Management and Budget asked the question, what about folks that went ahead and started complying early on when the 15 rule came out, went to compliance for the 2020 rule, couldn't resist putting a picture of my pickup truck in here once again for any of you that heard me speak before. My pickup truck's the little silver truck down there in the bottom right-hand corner, just happens to have a FGD wastewater treatment system in the background. The early adopters must have equipment installed to meet the 2020 limits by March 24th of this year. So March 24th was nearly 2 months ago for both FGD and bottom ash transport water. Equipment needed to be installed. If you installed the equipment, your FGD limits stay at the 2020 numbers of arsenic of 8, mercury at 34 part per trillion, selenium at 29 parts per trillion, and nitrate at 3 parts per million. The other part of this is with the early adopters and maintaining the 2020 limits, there is a requirement to permanently cease coal combustion by December of 32, allowing for more life of the units. One thing to note here is that what is in the rule versus what is in the preamble of the rule, there's some inconsistencies. First of all, there's a definition that commits to permanent cessation of coal combustion in reference to the paragraph there, 19E1. It also references no discharge of FGD, two slightly different items there. That's in 13G23. And then for bottom ash, there's no discharge of bottom ash that's referenced somewhere else. And in the preamble, it refers to unit retirement. While EPA in their webinar mentioned what their intent was here, the fact that the preamble and the rule has some consistencies certainly would encourage folks to comment on those. So the early adopter subcategory, first, needs to be achieved by date of publication. The facility is certifying that it has generated FGD wastewater after October 13th of 2020 and has installed biological or zero valent iron treatment equipment. And this is very specific. Biological or ZVI treatment is part of the requirement listed or proposed for the early adopter subcategory. And bottom ash handling equipment has been installed to meet all the applicable limits in the rule, and the unit will permanently cease coal combustion. Now, there are some areas that you may think about commenting here, and we'll get into common opportunities later on, but the rule states that must have an FGD discharge. So the question comes up, if you have a dry FGD unit, does that disqualify you from meeting the early adopter subcategory on bottom ash? Because it clearly states in the rule, and for FGD and bottom ash. The citation refers to the permitting authority having approved the bottom ash transport water blowdown percentage. That's part of the BPJ analysis. Has that been completed by the permitting authority already? It requires the initial certification statement for bottom ash transport water within 60 days of publication. It as part of the early adopter also, there is a notice of planned participation requirement similar to what we've seen in previous rulemaking, and requirement for annual progress reports on what is happening at that site, how that progress is going to go to cessation of coal combustion. It states elsewhere that the facility could go to zero discharge instead of ceasing operations, and that's where there's that inconsistency in the preamble and what's in the actual rule there. So just keep an eye out on those as you're reviewing. For the FGD and bottom ash systems, there was elimination of 2 subcategories. The first one that was eliminated was the high flow subcategory. EPA is proposing to take that completely off the table for reasons they state in the document. And then secondly, EPA is proposing to eliminate the low utilization subcategory as it applies to both FGD and bottom ash transport water. EPA has some verbiage in there as to why they are proposing to eliminate that in the preamble, and it essentially goes down to not a whole lot of units actually applied to take advantage of that, or at least the EPA is not aware of a number of units taking advantage of that subcategory. For both FGD and bottom ash, there's a retirement subcategory. Some of the changes that have occurred there are, first of all, EPA proposes to extend the notice of planned participation for retirement to 60 days after the ELG publication. But then they've also are proposing a direct rulemaking, or they made a direct rulemaking identifying that date as June of this year. Another opportunity to comment, because we won't know what the final rule looks like until it's actually published and comments have to be in. So it would be difficult for folks to make a decision on jumping in on the early retirement subcategory if we don't know what the financial impacts and timing costs are. And as I mentioned earlier, it also requires those annual progress reports and a copy of the filing to cease coal combustion that was done with your state utility commission, or when that estimated time of filing is, when do you anticipate filing that paperwork. Of note also, and what I've show up here, is for the coal retirement category, and this really applies to all of the subcategory, all the categories that EPA is proposing to regulate here, is there is a TSS, total suspended solids limit, and an oil and grease limit for each one of these areas. So some questions. What happens with the voluntary incentive plan? Is that an end option? So if a plant chooses to go with the VIP, are they allowed to continue discharge in perpetuity? EPA in their webinar indicated that that was their intent. It would be advantageous to anybody that is looking at taking advantage of the voluntary incentive plan to make sure that that is actually documented on EPA's part, and that there is not a end date for the VIP option. And then as we look at membrane technologies, what is the end fate of the brine? Has EPA fully evaluated what those options are? Certainly ash conditioning was mentioned within their documents, brine encapsulation, underground injection control or deep well injection. Those were all options that EPA has referenced, but they start getting into areas of potentially solid waste rules CCR rule, RECRA, and want to make sure there's some clear delineation on what's allowed and how that brine will continue to be defined once it gets applied to ash. Does it continue to be FGD wastewater or bottom ash transport water or whatnot, or does it get recategorized? For bottom ash transport water, there are three essential categories here. There's a general category, and what EPA has put out or proposed in this rulemaking, or this proposed rulemaking, is no discharge of bottom ash transport water. This is as opposed to what was in the 2020, or what is in the 2020 rule, which was an allowance for up to 10% of your wetted unit volume. And compliance with this, EPA is proposing to be as soon as possible, 60 days after the publication of the rule, or as long as December of 2029. It keeps the exception for flange leaks, flange breaks in place. It continues to allow the discharge from a bottom ash transport water system to be sent over to the scrubber, FGD scrubber, at which time it no longer becomes FGD transport water, it becomes scrubber water, but it must run through the scrubber itself. That may or may not be problematic for some sites, depending on what you do with your gypsum, the configuration of the scrubber units themselves, and their ability to handle the changes in chemistry and solids. The early adopters option for bottom ash transport water limits the discharges per the 2020 rule. As I stated, the up to 10% allowance. If you are in compliance with the rule for both FGD and bottom ash, as I mentioned, that and word again, bottom ash blowdown must be in accordance with permit authority limits. And this is where there's a wrinkle, because this permit authority limits, this blowdown would be per a BPJ analysis. And I'm aware of a number of jurisdictions that they have not gotten around to a BPJ analysis yet. So folks have not closed the loops on their bottom ash treatment systems, have not completed the design of their blowdown systems, because they don't know what their limits are yet. So we've got a little bit of a chicken and the egg challenge there. And then EPA also offers a pre-treatment standards for existing sources, and that would apply for anybody that is looking at doing pre-treatment, going to a POTW. And very straight up, this says no discharge within 60 days of the rule publication. So the general and the pre-treatment standards are pretty close to the same there. The nuances there is that, and I believe this may have been a typo on the part of EPA, that the applicability date is 60 days after publication of the rule versus 3-year implementation period that has traditionally been out there for other waters. So continuing on with bottom ash transport water, the following per the 23 proposal are not considered bottom ash transport water. Low volume, short duration discharges from minor leaks. Now, the question is raised, well, what exactly is a minor leak? Minor maintenance events. Once again, a need for definition. And then anything that is considered cleaning water from FGD paste or encapsulation equipment. The rule also, or the proposal also touches on legacy wastewaters. Legacy wastewaters are waters that CCR contact wastewaters or CCR wastewaters generated before the as soon as possible date. So that would be a date which would be 60 days after publication once again, and and compliance is as far out as, once again, that December of 29 date. There is no national standard for these legacy waters. EPA is proposing that we ask the state regulatory authorities to do a BPJ analysis to set these technology-based effluent limits, taking into account what CCRs may be present in these legacy waters, and to also take into account what the closure status is on some of these impoundments that hold the legacy waters. A little bit of overlap with the CCR rule here, both on timing and logistics. It could require treatment in existing wastewater treatment systems. So if we can keep keep in front of where legacy wastewaters are, it's a potential out for how to deal with these waters without having to deal with any new regulations or more stringent regulations. In the preamble and the discussion for CCR impoundment dewatering, where a lot of these legacy wastewaters exist, EPA clearly differentiates between decant water, and that's the treated water that's or the water that's on top of the impoundment, where there's no resuspension of solids, and then dewatering water where there's mechanical resuspension of the solids or significant contact with the solids, and that would be the pore water or the interstitial water that is in there. EPA referenced that some jurisdictions have already taken this approach and have suggested that this may be an approach to how to differentiate between the various types of waters that are in here, and may have different rules for different legacy waters, so to speak. Combustion residual leachate. So this gets into what is leachate, which EPA continues to maintain the definition that they established earlier. Leachate from landfills or surface impoundments containing combustion residuals. Leachate is composed of liquid, including any suspended or dissolved constituents in that liquid, that is percolated through waste or other materials placed in a landfill, or that passes through the surface impoundment's containment structure, which would be the bottom of the structure, any dikes, berms, whatnot. And this includes seepage and or leakage from a combustion residual landfill. Leachate includes wastewater from the landfills and surface impoundments located on non-adjoining property when under the operational control of the permitted facility. And that's one that needs to be read slowly several times over, that if it's not on your site, but is still under the operational control of the permitted facility, it is still leachate. The proposed rules for leachate are that it meets the TSS limit and that I referenced earlier. They use a arsenic and mercury limit, arsenic of 8 parts per billion, mercury of 356 parts per trillion, that are based off of the PhysChem chemical precipitation best available technology that was established for FGD back in the 2015 rulemaking. The definition does appear to differentiate between what is leachate and what is stormwater. There is some discussion in the document that leachate discharged via groundwater could broaden the applicability of this rule, and proposes annual monitoring of groundwater. That's another area that comment would be advised. The pre-treatment standard here, not sure if this is again a typo here, was is shown as the pretreatment standard timing is 60 days from date of publication. And as I mentioned earlier, typically this is 3 years or up to 3 years after publication. And of note, while EPA has been using best available technology based on what they had in PhysChem for FGD, CCR leachate could have arsenic concentrations that are significantly higher than what is typically found in FGD wastewater. So once again, this is a site-specific opportunity. Need to be aware of what your water looks like and what those specific challenges may be. So in the new leachate proposal, first of all, as I mentioned, it refers to groundwater. U.S. Supreme Court in 2020 clarified that discharges of pollutants through groundwater are subject to NPDES permits if they are functionally equivalent of a direct discharge. And this is where you're going to need to work with your environmental council as you interface with your permitting authorities and the various EPA regions. Supreme Court said there's a possibility that if your surface impoundment is in communication through groundwater, that it's functional equivalent of a point source. EPA recommends that all facilities with coal combustion residuals evaluate if they are subject to this interpretation, working with your permitting authority, as I just mentioned. EPA has assessment requirement or assessment that requires extensive information, some of which may be already out there through the CCR rule. Taking a look at those impoundments. So careful that you aren't duplicating efforts or collection that you're already doing under a different rulemaking. I know a lot of utilities have a CCR group that is separate from their water groups. EPA also has a much broader list of parameters that they are proposing for monitoring beyond the arsenic and mercury, and may want to comment on this, and I'll reference this again in a few slides, that the monitoring parameters that EPA is proposing may be outside of the authority that they have under effluent limitation guidelines. There are other ways that they can collect the data, certainly. Is it appropriate to be in an ELG if it's not a regulated parameter? And then, again, annual monitoring and reporting of indirect discharges to surface waters, groundwatering monitoring where CCR or combustion residuals leave the landfill, and surface impoundments and where it may enter surface water bodies. So for FGD and bottom mass transport water, the rule continues to include permit language addressing generation must run orders. This gets into grid reliability. The push to retire coal-fired facilities, several jurisdictions have already said you can't retire your coal plants until you have replacement generation online. If this is a concern for your utility, this is a good time to either begin or continue dialogue with your state utility commission or DOE as appropriate to make sure that if you believe there's going to be an impact on grid reliability, that gets documented early and provisions are made. These are technology-based limits, end-of-pipe limits, where you can't use dilution to solve the challenge. If we're pulling other waste streams into the mix, the combined waste stream formula may very well apply to any commingled waters. So leachate going into an FGD wastewater treatment system, for instance, need to take a look at whether that combined waste stream formula is applicable or not. Once again, conversations with your local regulatory authorities. For the early adopters requirement, There is a notice of planned participation in there and the monitoring reports. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is there is a website requirement, a publicly accessible website similar to what's in the CCR rule that documents what the progress is to compliance and closure, and including some monitoring data. Fortunately, if this applies or if this continues to be in the final rule, EPA did indicate that they are willing to allow this to be a combined site for the ELGs and the CCR rule. Interesting and of note, this is not in the rule per se, but it's in the preamble. EPA noted that Wisconsin had found PFAS, polyfluorinated alkyl substances, in discharges at 8 power plants. And there's some discussion about PFAS in here. This PFAS has come up in a number of EPA's recent water rulemakings. It's certainly a national constituent of concern. This is an area where your sites may want to get proactive in taking a look at just how much PFAS is in the water you're withdrawing from your water bodies to start with. So take that under advisement. It also adds some definition to what exactly is a surface impoundment versus a tank to differentiate between the two. So areas for comment. We mentioned earlier that the pretreatment standards, have a 60-day compliance date after promulgation, not 60 days to 3 years. So why isn't this similar, or should it be similar to what's been proposed for FGD historically? There is only a notice of planned participation for retirement, and would transfer to the subcategory be allowed? You may not know, based on the final rule not being available until much likely late fourth quarter, early first quarter, government shutdowns and budget issues withstanding. We may not know what the requirements are before the required June 23rd date. Does that give you enough time and information to make those decisions? With both the FGD and bottom ash transport water, right now the no discharge of these, it allows just the water to be reused for boiler makeup. EPA has certainly referenced reverse osmosis as a technology. If we have this very clean water, why would it not be appropriate to use in other areas within the plant, as it's certainly cleaner than the water we're pulling out of the surface waters or wells around us, and it would be a potential to reduce water usage at the facilities, getting closer to that zero water goal. EPA is soliciting comments on whether bottom ash contact water should be subject to no discharge requirements. Caution on, could your landfills be impacted here? The moisture that's still on or the free water that's still on the bottom ash when it's transported over to your landfill, does that turn into leachate at that point, or does your leachate turn into bottom ash transport water, contact water there? Need some additional clarification. EPA certainly in their webinar stated what their intent was, but it's not documented in the proposed rule right now. Again, the early adopters should be allowed to have bottom ash transport water exception with dry FGDs and other applications that would avoid discharge of FGD wastewater. Specifically here, that's the word and. EPA indicated that that was not their intent, that they're looking at bottom mass transport water and FGD wastewater early adopters as separate issues. If you're an English professor, that may not be how you interpret the verbiage there. More importantly, if you're an attorney that's litigating this, how would that be interpreted? So clear definition there. Also, it's very interesting that EPA was specific on the technologies required to comply with the 2020 early adopters. ELGs use a basis of technology to comply with limits, but here EPA was very specific, stating biological or zero valent iron treatment systems. So was that their intent? And then early adopters should not have to retire by 32 as stated in the preamble, but should be at no discharge. Once again, their intent versus what was actually written there. Certainly to comment on that, to make sure it gets in the docket, that even though EPA has stated what their intent is, want to make sure those areas get cleaned up. Requirements to conduct annual monitoring of leachate parameters for indirect discharges, and reference the table here. This is an extensive list of materials. As I mentioned earlier, this is a data collection program and groundwater monitoring, which is typically not under the Clean Water Act, but under the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. So this is an area on that EPA had struck down in past rulemakings where bromide monitoring was put out there, even though it was not regulated. This appears to be something similar, something to raise a question on. Should EPA offer an optimization period for zero discharge during adoption, where if you have a discharge during this time period, it would not be a violation? They have done this in other areas where they've allowed implementation periods. Another opportunity for comment. Chimney drains. EPA talks about chimney drains and the fact that stormwater that is routed into a leachate collection system, they're looking for how this should be treated, whether there should be a separate subcategory for this where the flows are combined, but the stormwater does not percolate through the impoundment or the landfill. Reference the bottom mass transport water maintenance tanks before, or the maintenance on the tanks. Do we need to have an exception there? And then, interestingly enough, there is a slew of definitions that are in the rule, even though legacy wastewater is not clearly defined in the 2015 version, the 2020 version, or the proposed 23 version. So a comment there may be that EPA has some clear definition on that. So as advice, Lindy and I have worked, Lindy Johnson, my associate here, and I have worked through this rule over the last 15 or more years. And our guidance would be read the rule and the preamble and the technical development document as you're formulating your comments back to EPA. Work with your legal counsel and comment as appropriate. The comments, even though we know what we may have heard what EPA's intent is in their webinars, if the comments are not made and included in the docket, the ability to have them referenced in future regulatory reviews or subsequent regulatory reviews or potential litigation could be limited. So get it into the docket, have your say now. And beware that the final rule may be different than what is proposed. Historically, there have been significant changes, and any legal challenges that occur could by direct logic, delay your implementation dates out there. So stay involved with industry groups as best you can and be informed. So with that, that closes my comment period here, or my comments on the rule. If there are any questions, glad to address those. I think they asked that. Want to put those questions into the question box, and glad to address them.
Well, thanks, Bill. Yeah, great presentation and breakdown of this new information. We do have a number of questions here already, but like you said, for those who still have one, please go ahead and drop them in to the questions box. So let's get started. The first one we have here, Bill, you mentioned a handful of different dates here today. When will we know what the final rule date will be?
That is an outstanding question insofar as we don't know, but indications are, and I do have a crystal ball on my desk. Historically, it's taken EPA at least 6 months to, following receipt of comments, to get a rule out there. And so I would not anticipate seeing anything before the end of the year. And right now, I would say first quarter is my most likely prediction.
All right, thank you. How about, will state regulatory authorities be able to provide BPJ analysis in a timely manner?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I've chatted with state regulators and asked them, hey, what amount of information and expertise do you all have at your disposal that the federal government doesn't have? And as we're evaluating leachate and we're evaluating bottom ash transport water, what is appropriate? And the state permitting authorities certainly need help. In some jurisdictions, they've actually asked the utilities to help them with the data collection and evaluation efforts so they can do their due diligence in establishing what BPJ is. Typically, it's taken as long as a year. Rarely do they do it under 6 months. So, yeah, it's certainly a burden on the state permitting authorities that they are not necessarily prepared to meet.
All right, good one. The next one I see here, the EPA clarified some of their outstanding concerns in their webinar. You mentioned a handful of things that you still think we need to comment. Do we?
Absolutely. Just because EPA mentioned them verbally in their webinar, it behooves industry to get the comments into the docket to get those concerns stated. And it's the old adage, if it's not written, it never happened. So yes, get them out there.
Great. How about this one? How does the early adopter subcategory installed by date impact the FGD wastewater treatment projects that have been started but are not yet in service?
Oh, that's the proverbial $1 million question. Probably a little bit more than $1 million in this case. Yeah, that's a good question and comment back to EPA that we've had folks that have been looking at the 2015 and 2020 rules. With the 2020 rule, there was some certainty and on the direction they needed to proceed in. And a lot of folks are just now buying equipment, starting construction, and they've made significant financial commitments to comply with what the existing rules is. And now there's an indication that, hey, if you're not done, you need to potentially change path. That is certainly an area for comment, to raise the question and to not only raise the question, but define what you want. a possible suggestion is, rather than being in service, that projects are underway. Equipment has been ordered to change that definition at this point.
Okay, and another early adopter question here. How does that subcategory installed by date impact the bottom ash transport water systems that are still waiting for the state to finish their analysis?
Yeah, and I think I touched on that a little bit. It gets into the chicken and the egg. Systems installed to meet the 2020 rule. Well, the 2020 rule states that your discharge quality and volume is subject to a BPJ determination by the local regulatory authority. A number of those determinations have not been completed. So yes, the bottom ash transport system may be in, or the bottom ash system may be in place. Yeah, there may be a purge off of it still, where it's an open loop system, 100% open loop system, but without having that definition in place, the BPJ being completed, it becomes just logistically impossible to be in compliance with the rule that is still subject to the state to complete their activities. So certainly yet another area. A potential comment would be, that the project is underway, similar to what we discussed with FGD, that if we're waiting for a BPJ determination, that should be an allowance for that pre-existing or that early adopters category.
All right, and I'm seeing one last one here. How long have you been working on PFAS in alliance with Johns Hopkins, and how does that relationship work?
For Stantec, I'm not real sure. I know that relationship has gone back at least 2 years, if not longer. And we have the Stantec Research Institute that does collaborate on emerging issues and technologies with academia and industry, that not only do we want to design the solutions and implement them, but we also want to develop the solutions. So the capture and destruction of PFAS is something that our Stantec Research Institute has been working on collaboration, not only with Johns Hopkins, but other groups. And if you're interested, I can certainly get you more information on that.
All right, I just see another one coming in here. It says the EPA presented a very low number of MWs expected to retire as a result of the proposed rule change. How is that accurate?
Very good question. It really gets into what EPA is using as a yardstick. Are folks retiring because of other economic factors? Are they retiring because of the ELG rule, or are they retiring because the cost of fuel? Is it other initiatives that are underway? Just last week, EPA put a proposed rule for carbon emissions out for fossil plants with very different dates than are on these proposed ELGs. It comes down to what their yardstick is, and certainly an area to challenge. I would put a plug out there for EPRI and the Edison Electric Institute, EEI, have probably better grasp on what industry is doing and why than EPA necessarily would have. And EPA uses both of those organizations as references to begin with.
All right, well, I'm not seeing any other questions here in the box, so thanks, Bill. With that, we're going to wrap it up today. I appreciate all of those of you in the audience for your participation. If you have any other questions for Bill, you can see that his contact information is up on the screen, and we did drop it into the chat. You will receive an email within the next week with your participation certificate. We will also be posting this presentation on stantec.com if you'd like to listen again or share it with a colleague. Our next presentation is on Wednesday, June 7th, where our panel will be talking about the critical role of potable reuse and what that will play in our changing climate. The link to register is in the chat as well. We look forward for you joining us again soon, and thanks everybody.